a particularly big problem. Yet the government is going to end the payments of disability living allowance not for 0.4% of claimants, but for 20%. Figures just don't add up.
Olly.
I think what we're talking about here is responsibility across society, to be honest. I think everyone here would agree that anyone who can work should work. But there's responsibility in other sections of society as well. There's responsibility on those who earn a lot of money to make sure that they pay all those taxes. There's a responsibility of government to take care of those that are most vulnerable in society and not demonise them. For example, today we have, the great example of a very highly paid civil servant not paying any income tax on a dodge that was signed off by David Willetts and Danny Alexander. That's what we're talking about when it's about responsibility from the top and the bottom of society. My father was on disability allowance. He did so for many years. He was dragged for what we saw as a family as very pointless examinations, which were quite, it was a removal of his dignity. It wasn't nice. I wouldn't wish anyone to go through that again. So I think instead of demonising and being divisive, the government should instead look at the whole of society, the whole of responsibility of all of us to pay into the system.
On a very practical level, are there specific changes to what is being proposed that the Fabian Society recommends, or do you have alternative policies which you would wish the government to adopt in its reforms?
We released a report a couple of weeks ago looking at the theories of universalism. Basically, you can't have a welfare state if the public don't support it. So as a consequence, the Fabian Society feels that everyone needs to have a stake in the welfare state in some way. If you target services too tightly, if you target services at poor people, they become poor services. That's basically the belief of the Fabian Society.
We are living in a very difficult economy. Jobs are hard to come by. The working population are facing high inflation, stagnant wages and rising living costs. Is it unreasonable to expect, therefore, that actually the people who are not in work should also be facing some constraint of the money that they're receiving?
I think we go away again to, the responsibility across the whole of society. I think everybody understands that the deficit needs to come down. The Fabians accept that. The opposition Labour Party accepts that. But I don't think people feel, especially those who are in the squeezed middle that you talk about, I don't think people feel that the burden's being shared particularly fairly across society. I think that they feel that the government are perhaps using politics to target and demonise small sections of the population.
Richard Wellings, one of the difficulties in these programmes seems to be the idea of getting people back into work. I don't think anyone would disagree with getting people back into work, but in order for that to happen, there have to be jobs for them to go to. Isn't that a fundamental flaw in the strategy, is the economic circumstances in which we find ourselves?
It is, and if you look at the pattern of, say, incapacity benefit claimants, you find in some of these old industrial cities like Glasgow, you have very high rates. So this is actually hidden unemployment. So it can be up to 1 in 5 people in the population of working age are claiming incapacity or ESA. So yes, it's a big problem. And what we need to do is we need to liberalise the economy so people can move to areas where there are jobs, and that means getting rid of our very strict planning controls and so on. So it's a much wider issue. Also possibly reducing the minimum wage so that more jobs are created for people with low skills.
Is the government really missing a trick with this? I mean, it's being billed as the most radical overhaul of the welfare system since the 1940s, replacing all of these 6 payments with 1 payment and so on. However, it is, and as you know, almost Byzantine still in terms of its complexity and so on. Are we missing a fundamental opportunity to more radically rethink the way we deliver welfare services in this country?
Well, the problem is the current system has evolved over a very, very long period, and so where there have been holes and perceived unfairnesses, then a new benefit's been introduced to try and correct the problem. But it's very difficult to actually come up with some sort of rational new system without making huge mistakes, and we've already seen that with the government's botched reform of child benefits. So I'd actually rather they stuck with the current system and actually started having incremental changes to some of the benefit rates. I think that would be a far more effective policy.
Just a reminder, you're listening to Scott Craig on The Voice of Russia, and today I'm talking about the UK government's plans for welfare reform with my guests Richard Wellings, Olly Parker and Ian Greaves. Olly Parker, are we missing a more radical opportunity to rethink things?
I think there is a radical way you can reform the welfare state in a way that's fair to everyone and that's simple to everyone. And I'll go back again to the concept of universalism and everyone having a stake. If there's a benefit which everyone gets and is set at a certain level, people understand that. Child benefit, for example, is seen as a fair benefit. It simply reflects that society believes that when you have a child, you're entitled to some extra help from the state to raise that child. It's incredibly popular, it's incredibly simple, and it works.
Ian Greaves, in an ideal world, how would you remould disability benefits in the most ideal way for what is needed, in your view?
Well, I think that what we've got with the universal credit is changing or sort of modifying 6 very, very complicated benefits and replacing them with a single very complicated benefit. And the reason why it's complicated is it's means tested. And I entirely agree that the universality is something that we want to be aiming at. And the way that we tried to approach it originally as a society under Beveridge was to introduce a national insurance system. And I'd like to see that come back again. And I'm glad that that Liam Byrne was talking about really trying to reinvent Beveridge. And for me, it's a way of consolidating the national insurance system, of having a system which people do feel that they have a stake in. And the changes to and the cuts to employment and sport allowance, unfortunately, we're going in the opposite direction. We're taking the national insurance element and reducing it to rubble. So very much about going back to a national insurance system. And yes, we do have an opportunity of looking at the way that disability living allowance is not functioning as a benefit, and particularly it's not functioning in the way that it doesn't cover the costs of care.
Richard Wellings, looking at the politics of this, the scenes that we saw last night in the House of Commons, it does seem as though the government is going to get its way, albeit through designating its reforms as financial measures, which is a fairly, I think, almost unprecedented measure to be taken. Do you have concerns that these reforms are not actually receiving proper scrutiny?
I do, and if you look at some of the recent reforms like child benefit, it's clear that they weren't thought through properly in the first place. My main worry is that the reforms are probably too timid and they're not going to actually make much difference. So, for example, the benefit cap, if people are forced to move out of very expensive parts of London, then the local councils will be obliged to rehouse them if they're a family. So that's actually going to cost more money than it saves. So they need to think through these reforms and actually work out how they're going to work across the board.
Just a reminder, you're listening to Scott Craig on The Voice of Russia, and today I'm talking about the UK government's plans for welfare reform with my guests Richard Wellings, Olly Parker and Ian Greaves. Olly Parker, do you think this bill is actually being scrutinised properly? I mean, the government, in effect, is bypassing the objections of the Lords.
Yeah, I mean, it clearly was being scrutinised properly, wasn't it? But the government have decided to make it it's an act of parliament, isn't it, where they can just ram-raid it through. And I think that is wrong. I mean, when you look at the people in the Lords who have voted against this bill, you know, it's the Church of England, it's Nigel Lawson, who was Chancellor under Margaret Thatcher. I mean, these aren't left-wing radicals. These, this is a broad spectrum of society represented in the Lords, part of it's represented in the Lords, that are voting against these measures. And I think it's a real shame that the government's gone this way and not listened to some of the expertise on offer.
And if there's one thing from the expertise on offer that they could pick that would make what's being proposed better, what would it be?
One thing? I'm not sure I could limit it to one thing, but I'd definitely say that they should go back and look at the housing part of this, because I think that's going to be a real killer over the coming years.
I'm afraid we must leave it there for today. We're out of time, but my thanks today to my guests, Dr. Richard Wellings from the Institute of Economic Affairs, Olly Parker from the Fabian Society, and Ian Greaves from Disability Rights UK. You're listening to Scott Craig on The Voice of Russia. Stay with us.